Hey, welcome back to Pagitt Radio. In a conversation with Roger Olson. Roger is a theology professor, an author, blogger, and he does that work out of Waco, Texas at Truett Seminary, part of Baylor University. And Roger has written a book called Against Calvinism, trying to suggest that there is a broader spectrum of evangelicalism than what many of us have been told, and that many of us have been encouraged to consider. And before the break, I was asking Roger if he thinks that in the continuum that has produced modern-day evangelicalism, kind of the parachurch movement, the 20th century kind of generous, everyone's a part of this even though you have a differing theological backgrounds, perspective that came out of a debate between liberalism and fundamentalism at the early 20th century, late 1800s, early 1900s. And then people suggested there's a third way. There's this broader, more inclusive, less separatistic approach called evangelicalism or neo-evangelicalism. And I was suggesting that perhaps what's happened in the world that we live in is that these neo-evangelicals, these neo-Calvinist evangelicals of today, have basically said, no, there is really one tribe that represents evangelicalism. And I was speculating and trying to bait Roger into agreeing with me if he would, that really plays the role of fundamentalism in this storyline. And that while the neo-Calvinists have tried to say that they're evangelicals, aren't they really the fundamentalists in the play? So,
without trying to put too fine a point on it, let me explain here just quickly what I see going on.
Great.
Some of these Calvinistic spokespersons among us, among evangelicals, are saying, look, there is this phenomenon called evangelicalism that you were talking about. Mm-hmm. It's big, it's diverse, it's broad, it's too big, it's too diverse, but it exists. So they're willing to say lots of people are evangelicals.
Gotcha.
who don't agree with them theologically. But then they say, oh, well, that's sociologically they're evangelicals. Theologically, we're the only real evangelicals.
Oh, interesting.
See how that goes?
Yes, that's okay. Interesting. So sociologically, meaning how people organize themselves, what churches they would go to, that kind of, but not
really
in the content. That. Yes, right.
Right. They're kind of dismissive of that, like, oh, well, lots of people call themselves evangelicals, and we'll let them. But our theology is the true center, the norm of authentic theological evangelicalism. So people get confused when they listen to them. They've got to listen very carefully to which they're talking about. Are they talking about evangelicalism as a sociological phenomenon? There they can be very generous because they don't really care. They think it's shallow anyway. When they're talking about evangelicalism theologically, they're at the center, and they define the boundaries.
Well, let me ask you about that. If the group, for that group who would make that distinction, what would they think of the National Association of Evangelicals? That's a national group that kind of works, and would they say that's a sociological category more than so? So that's not really them either.
No, they probably think it was a good thing when it started in 1941, and it might have some usefulness today. But their take on it, in my experience of listening to them, is that it's just become too broad to be of any real depth or importance. And so what they want to do is sort of become the new evangelical movement that's Calvinistic and that gives depth to true evangelicals. So in their view, there's sort of a group of people within evangelicalism that have the right theology that the rest don't.
Yeah, and
they're it.
And the importance of this to people like you and I who observe these things and run around in this world isn't just like who gets to name themselves, this by this sort of obscure title. It really has to do with how willing leaders in these movements and people in the churches of these movements are to engage with others. Because at some point, it really starts to have a judgment as to the legitimacy of the other person's expression of faith.
Right, exactly. So there are Calvinists that I can have good, fruitful, beneficial conversations with about theology. And there are others I can't, because the moment the conversation begins, I realize that the rhetoric they're using excludes me.
Right. Well, okay, so isn't some of this, I know we had a bit of this conversation a couple of years ago when I was down at Truett, but isn't some of this, couldn't it find its root in the whole metaphor of being Centerset? Like, I know that being bounded, that being Centerset, meaning like how you would gather around some things of interest, like a pool party where you all gather around the pool, as opposed to boundaries, which would be walls or fences that are put up. And so people are much more attracted to saying, what are the 6 things or 4 things or 9 things that we all gather around? That's so much better than setting up all these rules about what you can do and can't do. But then don't you ultimately, in Centerset theory, end up arguing about what's included in the Centerset? And isn't that so isn't it Centerset just really another version of that same kind of exclusivity that comes from the bounded set? It's just rather than being over 19 things, it's over 9 things?
See, I don't think so, because in a bounded set, there are definite boundaries so that you can tell who's in and who's out. That's the whole purpose of boundaries.
Right.
In a centered set, people are positioned in some relation to the center, maybe further away, maybe closer to it, but it's a matter of gradations or shades. It's not a matter of either or.
I see. So when these folks suggest
people
that,
I would say are closer to the center of evangelicalism, and some people I would say are further away from it, but they're still evangelical. Whereas in the bounded set view, you're either evangelical or you're not, period.
I see. So when someone says that part of the Centersetness is holding to Calvinistic theology, and they're like, that's at the center, you would say, no, it's not at the center. That's not a requirement.
Historically, it's not.
Yeah.
Right. I would just argue historically it hasn't been for 300-400 years since the Great Awakening. So why are they saying that? That's what I'd like to know. Why are they suddenly arguing that? It seems to me like some of them want to be popes of this big thing called evangelicalism because there's money and power involved.
Oh, interesting.
If you can grab the control over it. Others are more sincere, perhaps, and they really have a theological passion and vision for Calvinism. And I'm all for that. Have vision and passion for your theology. But don't go around, saying that people who've been in the evangelical camp, or people like them for 300 years, suddenly aren't because they don't agree with your particular theology of it.
Or if they are, that somehow they're a second-class citizen there. Because I hear that a lot. Like, sure, you're in, but that's only because you just really haven't awakened to the great.
Yeah. We're praying for you. Is what they tell me.
Well, what do you think the solution to this is? Like, because I know as a person who feels real pressure in progressive or liberal Christianity that there's a real litmus test that you must pass in that stream, sociologically and theologically. And I often feel like, well, someone like me doesn't totally fit perfectly in that world, so I feel ostracized a bit from that world. Then there's this kind of fundamentalist, neo-Calvinist world of evangelicalism that does the same thing. And there, it's a little cabal of, pastors and publishing houses, some that you and I have both published for, and Christianity Today magazine. Like, they've really, drawn in the circle to say you're out. What's the future when someone like me or Rob Bell or Shane Claiborne, these people are accused of not even being part of that very, very fine tribe? What do you think the hope is here? How could there be some kind of evangelicalism that could be more inclusive? Is it really going to be the need, do you think, to create something new that just needs to form and have a definitive start date, or is there a way to transform this debate back into something more generous?
Yeah, there are days, probably every other day, when I think it's too late to hold on to a unity among all evangelicals, and we've already fallen into 2 or more camps, and there's really 2 or more movements going on, 2 or more tribes, not one. But on some days I'm a little more optimistic, and I hold out hope and argue that we can get back, with the help of some well-meaning, broad-minded leaders, we can get back to the original vision of the 1941 National Association of Evangelicals, of a broad tent kind of perspective. And I'm looking to some of those people. I know we're not naming names here, but I'm saying there are people out there who hold out the same vision I do, who have some influence. And I'm trying to influence them, see.
Well, I would love to name names, and honestly, to have them on this program or on other blog things or anywhere, because I just feel like there's a whole group of people who are told that there's a set of no-talk rules, and you cannot behave outside of a certain cultural pressure, and if you do, you're going to be removed. And the social cost of being ostracized is so high that people just they're just quiet,
You can lose your job easily.
Oh, yeah. Oh yeah, you can lose your job, you can lose your friends, you can lose your publishing deals. I mean, I know authors who would totally agree with you and I in this conversation in private, but they're like, I'm not writing about that. And if I even say that, Doug, you and I were together, or that I was at something with Roger, I have to put a caveat that, hey, I don't agree with everything he thinks. Right? Mm-hmm. All those little caveats just to make sure you don't become guilty by association. And I just, it's so, as you know, I'm really geeking out on the insider of, a particular religious tradition. But this isn't only in this tradition, right? The same thing's happening in progressivism, the same thing's happening in Catholicism. Sure. Like, it seems to be one of the 21st century conditions that these situations of exclusivity are just becoming overly troubling. In a way that's just untenable, seems to me.
Well, there are people out there who I pin my hopes on for getting us back to a broad tent view of evangelicalism, and they are working quietly behind the scenes. But the problem is they're administrators of evangelical organizations who, if they became too outspoken about it, could be targeted by the neo-fundamentalists, and possibly it could cause them to lose their jobs.
Yeah.
And that's why I don't even want to name their names, because I don't want them to get in trouble.
I know it too, because you've had those conversations privately and trying to say, hey, let's try to make. And I'm with you that some days I think you can make transitions sort of 2 degrees at a time, and then there's other points where I'm like, I think people need to do what happened in the early 1940s, and that is put a stake in the ground, call some people together, and start moving on, because I just don't know that with that kind of threat that's looming over people. It's mean-spirited, right? Like you and I might be mean at other times, other places, but I not mean like this. Like these folks will take no hesitation for someone losing their job because they don't agree, which seems just...
Well, for example, one whose name I won't name has invented quotes and attributed them to me, and distributed them to Southern Baptist newspapers across the South, who have then published that Roger Olson at Truett Seminary said such and such. Well, I never said that,
right?
Or even anything close to that,
right?
And I have to think it's conscious and willful.
Yeah, I think
there just
you're right.
isn't any other explanation for it. And those are the people I've given up on. What can I do with them when they're dishonest and mean-spirited? But there are some more conservative than me who I can have conversations with and try to pull into this vision of the 1941 National Association of Evangelicals, reminding them it was a broad tent. There were people of all kinds of theological stripes involved in there who believed in the gospel, and that's what they had in common.
Well, Roger, I read a blog post today that said something about you, and they said, if Roger Olson is an evangelical, then maybe I could be one too. So just know that there's people on both sides, and sure appreciate the work you're doing. Congratulations on the book, and both of them. Be glad to tell people about it and have them read it. You should pick up the book if you're interested in this conversation. It's called Against Calvinism. When it's out, we'll be promoting it here on the station as well, or on the show. And so, Roger, thanks for being on. And if you want to follow up with Roger, you can do that over at Doug Pagitt Radio on Facebook, and you can find a link to his Pathos blog, and or just Google them all on your own. And so, Roger, thanks a lot, and we hope to cross paths soon.
Thanks. Bye.
All right. Hey, folks, we'll be back here with the Right On after the break on AM 950 and DougPagittRadio.com.